Do you have questions about domestic violence that you want to ask, but aren't sure if you should because they might offend somebody? An Australian show called You Can't Ask That removed those barriers by encouraging people to ask taboo questions about abuse. In the first episode of the new season, which just dropped on Netflix, people anonymously ask survivors of domestic violence numerous questions about abuse, and their answers are very informative. This is Unsilenced, a JBWS podcast where we have real conversations about abuse. I'm MC Robinson, and today we're speaking with
Ninna Roco, and by day, I'm a technology professional for large corporations, but with JBWS specifically, I started a few years ago as a CRT on the crisis response team, and I've also worked with the children's program. And most recently, I've had the privilege to help you here and there with the Unsilenced podcast.
In this episode, we explore the discomfort with asking questions about abuse, the inherent victim blaming that often follows victims of violence, and how these survivors are beacons of hope that a life without abuse is possible. So, a new season of You Can't Ask That just dropped on Netflix, and the first episode of the season is titled Domestic and Family Violence. So, a number of survivors in this show, they talk about their experience with abuse. So, what did you think in general about this episode?
I wasn't aware of this series.
Me neither.
I have to say streaming must be getting better at recommendations
Hmm.
because it put it right out there. And I have to say, I thought that the way this, not just the episode, but the series works by providing anonymous questions to
Hmm.
participants who've dealt with whatever the situation is, was a fantastic way to really allow people to ask taboo questions or difficult questions that you might not otherwise ask in
Hmm.
person, face to face. So first, in which the candid way, in the that they put that all together, I thought is a really great way to open up the dialogue. In addition, the fact that this particular episode on domestic and family violence really touched upon all of the topics that Unsilenced, your podcast, really touches upon. Why don't people just leave
Hmm.
situations like this? What are the signs of abuse? And why didn't you recognize it immediately?
Hmm.
Psychological and emotional toll of abuse, as well as those barriers to leaving, including what many people don't sometimes realize, that they could still love their abuser, and that
Hmm.
oftentimes there's still hope very much in fixing a relationship.
Hmm.
So I thought the fact that the first episode was able to ask hard questions,
Yeah.
touched upon that variety of topics, really helps to give people that don't have perspective on domestic violence or exposure
Hmm.
to it a different point of view that I hope is enlightening to them.
Absolutely. And I think you said this really well, but it's very similar to kind of the stuff that we're talking about on the podcast. The name of the podcast is Unsilenced, Real Conversations About Abuse. And so we also ask those taboo questions. And I think the anonymity associated with that show and being able to think, because there's a difference between thinking in your head, like, oh, I wonder why this is happening. Why don't they just leave? Why didn't they recognize this? Oh, this would never happen to me. These are all thoughts people have, and I think sometimes they also worry about being offensive if they say them out loud because they are kind of, there's victim blaming to these, but allowing that avenue is really, really instrumental, I think, for breaking the silence and allowing for conversation. Why do you think being able to ask those taboo questions is so powerful?
I think you just said it just right. One big piece of being able to ask those taboo questions and talk about taboo topics is to remove this and challenge the victim blaming narrative. So,
Hmm.
so that's, for me, a critical aspect because society still very much depresses these
Hmm.
topics. And what comes with that is our stereotypes of who victims are and
Yes.
and who can live in these relationships. So that's
Hmm.
number one. And then the second is the victim blaming narrative. So one of the things that this episode really did a wonderful job is it showed you that victims are at a variety of ages and stages in their life, a
Hmm.
variety of very diverse demographics. Gender-wise, we saw some male victims as well as some female ones,
Hmm.
and sexuality-wise. And I
Hmm.
think so. So one is challenging the stereotype of, oh, they're successful, they're a professional or a doctor. They would never find themselves in this relationship,
Hmm.
type of relationship. And then on the victim blaming side, I think Diane Williams, the president of CEO of JBWS, in one of your other podcasts, said it fantastic. Domestic violence grows in silence. And
Hmm.
so the problem with silencing this topic is that many people know someone who has experienced domestic violence. From 18 to 24, women have an increased chance of being in a situation that could be classified as domestic violence. And
Yeah.
I think we as a society don't realize it very well could be our colleague or the
Hmm.
person at the supermarket or a family member or a friend. And
Hmm.
so, again, thinking about the fact that we know someone who may have experienced domestic violence, when we don't talk about it,
Hmm.
we make it difficult for victims to seek help because there's a stigma associated with that. And
Hmm.
then we make it difficult, I think, for society, friends, family, coworkers to be able to understand how to recognize
Hmm.
potential signs in the people around us, and then also how to support them. If someone was brave enough to come to you, I think some people that don't talk about it or don't understand it wouldn't know necessarily how to react. And we get into some of that victim blaming and the stereotypes potentially, which is dangerous to hear if someone has come out looking for help.
Yeah. And you know what's interesting? Because you said how prevalent domestic violence is. And the flip side that I think people also don't realize and that we do a lot to educate people about is since it's so prevalent, the people that are using abuse is also equally as prevalent. I don't know statistically speaking, but the people who are causing harm in their relationships are also like people that you know in your community. They could be people in your family. They could be your best friend of 30 years. And I think by not talking about these topics, we're also not only silencing the voice of the victim, but we're also making it almost impossible for then a person who is using abuse to say like this is what I'm doing and I need help. And I think that that really feeds into it as well. Like I would have loved also, honestly, talk about an interesting perspective on this. I would have loved if they also asked people who are using abuse or have used it all of these questions as well. Because even the episode, which I did think was amazing, but it's interesting that it's victim focused and as it should be, but it would be interesting too because it almost feels a little bit like that blame is still there and still in society because I think one woman, forget exactly what she said, but I wrote it down. She said something along the lines of, they always ask, why didn't you just leave and not, why did they do this to you? And I thought that that was really, really, really powerful. Obviously, though, I don't think survivors should be required to share their story to get anybody to like believe them or support this cause. But like, do you think there's a bit more resonance when you hear about abuse from a survivor in the context where they're consenting and willing to share? Do you think that that has more power, especially when they're answering a question like, why didn't you just leave?
I have to tell you, I completely agree with a lot of what you said, and even the semantics in terms of not calling them abusers. I'm trying to get away from too, and
Yeah.
talking about people as people who use abuse.
Hmm.
It's really important in terms of having the perspective of the survivors themselves. Again, this episode was very powerful for me because, again, it showed you the diversity
Yeah.
of the types of people that are impacted by this.
Hmm.
And you hear from their mouths candidly the situations that they're in. And again, I think it goes against what we perceive sometimes as stereotypical
Hmm.
assumptions, maybe perpetuated by media or social media or in movies and such, that there's this physical violent explosion.
Hmm.
And,
Hmm.
and what this episode allowed us to see is that there are various situations that people find themselves in. There are various ways in which it escalated that they first didn't recognize the
Hmm.
signs of domestic violence. And by seeing the different situations, there was a woman who had forced into an arranged marriage at 14. There
Yep.
was a professional, Dr. O'Neill, who had two children, sounds like a successful home and was very successful in her own right. There was a homosexual individual who
Mhm.
found himself in a difficult relationship of power and abuse. So, one, you get an aspect of the different relationships they're in, but
Mhm.
then you really hear more about their journey. And I think what was impactful for me in answer to the question that people almost immediately go to, why didn't you just leave? Is you hear them say, if I just loved him enough, I could have
Mhm.
fixed, or I could make him a better person. And then everything from that, which, people take a step back from, they don't realize that there's still a relationship that was there. And then you also hear, I didn't have the financial means. I hated him, but I didn't know how to leave that situation. And in
Mhm.
many cases, because of the unhealthy relationships they had been living in, a lot of them had lost their self-esteem and just didn't think that they could do better
Yeah.
or that they could survive without the other person, again, whether financially or as a co-parent or all of those different
Yeah.
situations. So back to your question, just hearing it directly from the mouths of the survivors, seeing the diversity of situations in which they all dealt with
Mhm.
this, you really get a better understanding that it's not an easy situation to be in, and
Mhm.
that sometimes asking the question, why didn't you just leave? A, puts a little bit of the onus on the burden on the victim,
Yep.
and and then B, trivializes, I think,
Mhm.
the situation that they're in, which is
Mhm.
not an easy one.
Yeah. And I love what you said about the relationship being at the heart of this because I actually just did a podcast episode the other day and she was talking about, this is so difficult because there is an existing relationship. I mean, whether this person may love or hate this other person now, there's still a relationship, and that fact that there's a existing relationship plays into everything, and it is hard. And a lot of times these people who are being victimized want to leave and they want to get safe. They don't want the person that's hurting them, a lot of the times they don't want harm to come to them. So then it's also a really difficult situation where they're trying to balance their safety with wanting to protect them, with maybe wanting to get away from them. There's just so many diverse ways that domestic violence can present and how you can feel about the person that was harming you, that I thought they did a really good job of sharing, because you have some people that were like, oh, I hate him. Like, I don't care. I was just staying because my financial means depended on it. You had other people who were like, I don't hate him and I wouldn't hate him. And I thought showing that spectrum is really important because I think sometimes there's a tendency to portray domestic violence in one particular way of like, a woman is being abused by a man and she always wants to leave. And then it's not the case. Anybody could be abused by anyone and they don't necessarily have to hate their partner. It could manifest in a lot of different ways. And I thought that show, I really appreciated them having a gay man on. I thought that was really cool. That I think people also don't really think about a lot. I just really liked them highlighting the different voices.
And I think to your point, MC, asking why didn't you just leave? It maybe wasn't long enough, but
Yeah.
I went back and I rewatched bits of it. There were stories where they did in fact leave,
Yeah.
and sometimes a few times. And then what
Yes.
said is, but my partner came back groveling. He was crying,
Mm,
he threatened suicide. And then even their own families would kind of put pressure on them to say, he loves
yes.
you so much. Why aren't you taking him back? And then
Yeah.
it reminded me of your podcast with Robin, where on average, it takes a woman 7 attempts to leave
Yes.
an abusive relationship for good.
Hmm.
And again, just saying, why didn't you just leave? Again, it trivializes that may very well have been part of their journey.
Yes.
It's not that easy.
Yeah. And also, we say this all the time, leaving is the most dangerous time in a victim's life. So you have to also be very, very careful when you leave and connect to services. And, it's really dangerous. And, I love that you brought that up because I feel like when these kind of things happen, to your point about Dr. O'Neill, her family was saying, "Oh, like, but see, like he loves you so much, he would die without you. Like that's so romantic. That is the pinnacle of love. How could you do this to him?" And she even says she was being blamed for driving her husband to kill himself because what ended up happening was he killed himself, tried to kill her, and killed their two children. And people blamed her for what she did that led him to take those actions. I think this show is really powerful too because it gave the victims a chance to share their narrative because a lot of times victims for their own safety can't. They can't be vocal. They can't say what's really going on. They can't defend themselves. And I think having this perspective was really powerful because you hear Dr. O'Neill say that, and you're like, how could anybody say to her that she drove her husband to kill himself and the kids by leaving? It's very interesting.
I completely agree with you. It always shocks me. But then unfortunately, it doesn't when we look at kind of how it's easy online for
Yeah.
people to cast blame without knowing the full story. But the fact that she was being blamed for losing her own children. And, I think part of that story is he tried to kill her too. She just
Yeah.
happened to survive.
Yeah.
And something that was not really a domestic violence issue or a small issue became one of the worst cases in,
Mhm.
I think, Australian history in that
Yeah.
regard. And when you look at their story and their picture, again, they're what many would say successful
Yeah.
family. I think they started dating at 14 years old. They were in a small town and,
Yeah.
that young love. So it looks from the outside like it was a perfect relationship.
Yeah.
And then she pursued steps that one would think are the right steps. I think she tried to get separated properly and talked about co-parenting their children together,
Mhm.
pursued things in a rational way that we think many would think that makes sense. And he came to their house, as you've said, and just broke in with a licensed gun
Yeah.
and chose to take it to a horrific and tragic route. But the fact that she is the only survivor of that whole situation and of that family was blamed is unfortunate and goes back to
Yeah.
the fact that society doesn't know how to look at these relationships really.
No, and I think that you're right. There is a tendency to be like, well, if he's this upset, like what got him to that point? And so it's very interesting that that's like what society defaults to is like, well, let's find the fault in what you did to make this person do this to you. And I think that's even like one of the questions was literally, what did you do to provoke it? And I loved the response of the one woman that was like, being alive. And I thought that that was so simple and so powerful because there is this like thought a little bit, I think, in society where people think victims did something to piss off the person that's causing harm, or the person that's causing harm says, hey, you undercooked my mashed potatoes, you didn't pick up the kids, you didn't wash my clothes the way I wanted them to, blah 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 blah. And there's all of these things that they could blame on them, but for her to just say being alive. That's what provoked it. I just thought that was so powerful. Did you agree?
I completely agree because I think there's this matter of perception. It's you could do nothing wrong, in which
Hmm.
many of these people did, but someone that is in a particular mindset, perhaps, or in a space where they feel they need to abuse or
Hmm.
utilize that as a method of control, will find something,
Yes.
right? They will
Hmm.
find something. And then I think broader society, cultural norms and social conditioning allow us to put that burden of responsibility on the victim. And unfortunately, we've seen it in courts of law where the victim is on the stand for
Hmm.
almost proving that they
Hmm.
suffered enough.
Yes.
They bear, you have to bear physical scars or, be in such a situation.
Yeah.
And then they get truly, again, back to victim blaming. What were you wearing? What were you doing? Where were
Mhm.
you? What put yourself in this situation, which is a lot of what you're talking about here.
Yeah.
And it's unfortunate that we now they're having to live through it again on
Hmm.
and having to justify themselves when they in fact didn't do anything wrong.
It's so terrible. It's really difficult. And I also think about, we talked about this a little bit, but like the victims' families and people around them and their community members, I think part of it is also that they don't want to believe it's possible for these people to be capable of causing harm and abuse in the way that they are. It's almost human nature sometimes to want to believe the best in people. So when you hear, oh, this is happening to me, I think sometimes it's like, no, no, that couldn't possibly be. Like, I've known him for this long. I've known her for this long. She would never do that. Like, they would never do that. And I think it's really important for us to think critically beyond our immediate knee-jerk reaction of, no, I know them, to really reflect and listen and hear, because I think it's so prevalent and it's so common. And I just think that this show really, really highlights that, which has been pretty wonderful. Another thing that they talk about is how most of these people, the question they asked was, did you ever think this would happen to you? And I think every single one of them was like, no, no, I had no idea. And is that a common narrative that you've seen in working with victims? Do you think anybody would think that domestic violence would happen to them?
I think no one would want to put themselves in a situation if they thought that, they would find themselves in a,
Right?
domestic violence and family violence situation, even if, and some of the participants in the episode had had experience with that with their own parents.
Yes.
Right. And I feel pretty confident she wouldn't intentionally put herself in that
No
situation
way.
after having witnessed that as a child. So I think it's a little bit of back to people don't recognize by not talking about the issue and what healthy versus unhealthy relationships are. I think
Mm-hmm.
people don't recognize it starts out subtly, whether that's gaslighting or some kind of control that's psychological or financial or
Yep.
starting to isolate someone from their family and friends. And it's easy to rationalize those things and say, well, we're married now. We don't need to go out as
Yep.
much. Or
Mm-hmm.
he or she might get jealous of my relationship with so and so.
Mm-hmm.
It makes sense that one person handle the financials and, just manage it
Mm-hmm.
tight. So it's easy to rationalize. And over time, those small, subtle things can escalate.
Yeah.
We always think about the physical, but there's a psychological damage. Again, loss of
Mm-hmm.
self-esteem, that happens over time. There could be small calling of names,
Yeah.
right?
Oh,
And
yeah.
slowly breaking down people emotionally as
Mm-hmm.
well. So those are all very subtle. And like we said, it could happen over years. So
Mm-hmm.
they don't realize that that could be
Mm-hmm.
abusive. And because they don't perceive it as violent and
Mm-hmm.
the violent part of domestic violence. And so when people don't think it will happen to them, part of it is not recognizing that victims come from all walks of life
Yep.
and that domestic violence doesn't have to be this aggressive physical violence all the time, that
Yep.
it's something that can build and maybe ultimately culminate in the physical side of things.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I don't think anyone wants to put themselves in that situation. And so when you ask, did you ever think it can happen to you? No, you just kind of one day realize that it's been happening. But
Mm-hmm. And I think people also think it would never happen to me because they do have a certain notion in their head of what domestic violence looks like. And they think, oh, that's not me. That's not going to be me. I think until you're in it, you don't realize how easy it is to get into that kind of situation. And the more we can educate about it, the more we can talk about it, people will realize you could get into a relationship really quickly. A lot of times they come on really hard and fast and like super loving. It's very easy to get into these relationships and it's not somebody's fault for getting into them. And I think all of them saying, I never thought this would happen to me. I had no idea, really underscores how insidious these relationships can be. And to your point, domestic violence, just because the word violence is in there, we do tend to think it's physical. But I remember my coworker was saying to me once, emotional abuse is violence. It's emotional violence. And you can have the same. There's so many different forms of abuse, as you said, like sexual abuse, spiritual abuse, financial abuse. And you can learn about that on our website, actually, at jbws.org. But it really goes into depth on how abuse can manifest in so many different ways.
That's absolutely right. And it's hard to see, and I think it's the ongoing education that you do with this podcast and that JBWS and other domestic violence organizations do that has to be the hard work and that has to continue because it's forcing the conversations. And I
Yeah.
know it puts a lot of people in discomfort, but once we get it out of being taboo as a subject, then people hopefully will understand the prevalence of it and
Yes.
also recognize it a little bit
Hmm.
more.
To your point, I mean, the fact that they even had this episode on You Can't Ask That, I think is really, really amazing. And that's exactly what we want. Just the other day, they had a segment on What Would You Do about domestic violence as well, and how would you intervene? And so I really love to see in society that it feels like we're mo moving towards a place where we're talking about it and even see it online. People talk about abuse a lot. They talk about things that they went through. And I think all of this conversation is making people more aware. And it's always good to make people more aware of abuse so they can get connected to the resources for assistance.
Mhm.
How do you think a show like this might impact victims or society in general? Just being able to maybe, if a victim's watching that, what do you think it might instill in them? Or maybe somebody that knows somebody that's going through that. What do you think it might mean?
I think this episode was really powerful for exactly the fact that whether you're a victim, someone who uses abuse, I'm taking a page out of your book, and or a family and friend member who might be exposed to someone that needs assistance. I think what this episode did is it let them understand, it let a victim understand that there is another side,
Yeah.
that you didn't do anything wrong,
Hmm.
and there's ways to move forward. So I'll just leave it at that. And all of those ways are different
Hmm.
depending on your situation, which the episode did a wonderful job of highlighting. So from
Yeah.
a victim's perspective, I hope that it helps them understand that there is another side. There is
Yep.
life without abuse, and that there are resources and ways to get there. Um, I hope that for family and friends, it removes some of the negative stereotypes
Yeah.
towards who a victim is and what it means to be in a domestic violence situation.
Yeah.
Back to, you don't have to show the black and blues to
Yes.
see that someone is being manipulated or isolated or controlled, or again, back to understanding on both sides, whether you're a victim or family member or someone who uses abuse,
Hmm.
what a healthy and what an unhealthy relationship might entail.
Yeah.
So I truly believe that highlighting that in a way where you can hear directly from people that have lived through the situation
Hmm.
really will start to make an impact, start to maybe just change a little bit of the perspectives and the viewpoints of viewers that are watching this, where no matter where they might fit, as someone who uses abuse, a victim, or a support member, and someone who cares and loves someone that could be in the situation, that you see the different perspectives, you understand the difficult situations that
Yeah.
these individuals are in, and it's not easy to leave,
Mm-mm.
and that you know that there's resources and ways to live without abuse.
Exactly. Hope that a life without abuse is possible. And I think these people, most of them were saying, I'm happy. I have a lovely partner now. I went back to school, I established my life, I moved on. And I think that's something sometimes people who are using abuse will say, like, you'll never find somebody else to love you. You'll never live without me. You'll never make it. And it really destroys and degrades somebody's self-confidence and self-esteem and self-worth. So to see examples of people who defy that, who do go on and have loving relationships and amazing careers and great families, I think is just a really strong, amazing reminder that it is possible and that domestic violence agencies are here to support you to get to that future and help you. And I thought that that was just a really, really powerful moment at the end. Nina, you are wonderful to work with, and I'm so grateful you brought this show to my attention. It showcases how domestic violence can happen to anyone. We hope this conversation inspires you to keep having discussions about abuse so all people can feel comfortable reaching out for help. Thank you for listening to this episode of Unsilenced, Real Conversations About Abuse. This podcast is produced by JBWS, a domestic violence agency serving Morris County, New Jersey. Please let us know what topics you would like covered on this podcast by sending an email to podcast@jbws.org. Please note that this email address is only intended for content relating to the podcast. It is not meant to offer immediate assistance or access to services. If you live or work in Morris County and think you might be in an unhealthy relationship, JBWS is here to help. Please visit our website at jbws.org to learn more about our services, or call our 24-hour helpline to speak to members of our staff at 1-877-782-2873. If you recognize controlling or abusive behaviors in yourself, JBWS can also help change those behaviors. Through our Jersey Center for Nonviolence, JBWS offers programs for men, women, and adolescent males who have used abusive or controlling behaviors in their relationships. Please visit jbws.org/JCNV or call 973-539-7801 to learn more. If you don't live in Morris County, please call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233. Domestic violence grows in silence, so thank you so much for listening and helping us break through that silence through these types of conversations. Please follow us on social media and continue to share our content to get as many people talking about domestic abuse as possible.